So what I'm going to do is, so I'm in the computational research division up in the lab. We have a group that's a very young group, actually, in both my division and in the Earth Sciences division that has expanded rapidly, actually, in the last couple of years. And in fact, I went to an exit talk yesterday for a new student, which was really actually quite enjoyable. So it's nice to be here. What I'm going to talk about today is sort of introduce the science of climate change, or at least a little bit of it, but then jump into the role of computer simulation. And in fact, even walk you through sort of an example that's, a specific problem in modeling the atmosphere, but I think there's a more general lesson to be learned about computer modeling that I wanted to impart. So I have this great quote by Ed Lorenz, who I happened to hear. This is the title of a banquet speech that he gave once at a meeting. He's known as the father of chaos theory, and he actually was a meteorologist at MIT. And he said, "Climate is what you expect, weather is what you get." And it's an interesting saying. And what he means by that is we live in the weather. Last night it rained like crazy. Today's kind of nice. That's quite. I think it's going to be a very nice day, in fact. And those are very different weather states. And that's sort of like noise. It is noise, in fact. It's noise of the climate. The climate is generally thought of as sometimes said as the long-term mean of the weather. That's not really the way I would like to see it, but rather as the long-term statistics of the weather. And that means that besides having a mean value, it also has tails. And in fact, it's the extremes that are particularly interesting in climate change and the focus of some of our research, because it's actually a fairly open question is how extreme weather will change as the average climate changes. And so that's sort of what motivates us. So, but I thought I'd go back to just about global warming and whether or not you believe in it. You might not. You should. But there are many people today who don't. Public opinion is something that I don't understand. I don't think it's amenable to modeling. But what I wanted you to see is that there's statements that have changed over time. In 2001, the IPCC, I leave actually Saturday for the third meeting for the AR5 in Marrakesh, which is a place I've never been, said, an increasing body of observation gives a collective picture of a warming world and other changes in the climate system. And then that's a fairly weak statement. And then the next one's a little stronger, and it says, the new and stronger evidence that most of the warming observed over the last 50 years is attributable to human activities. That basically means burning fossil fuels. There's some component of land use change, and in fact, that's what yesterday's exit talk was about. And land use change actually could become a very serious player in the next 50 years. And so here's the real science behind it, actually, and let's just look at it. So this is the instrumental record. So up here.
Let me just say that people can't see you, it's being recorded.
Oh, okay.
And so if you point with your mouse, it would work a lot better.
All right.
Sorry. Yeah,
that's all right.
We do picture in picture. So there's a little picture for you and there's a little picture
I see. All right. So this one here that I'm pointing to is the thermometer record. And so you might ask, well, how do you measure the temperature of the globe if you don't have a thermometer everywhere? And in fact, my colleague Phil Jones, who was really at the center of the ClimateGate scandal, which was really not a scandal at all, but rather a crime, hacking of emails, in fact, and others have spent their entire careers trying to answer that question. And there's a variety of ways that one can infer what the temperature is in places where you don't have a thermometer or where you have one only for a little while, for instance. And so this is a very, I think, a very robust analysis and has stood even some severe criticisms from here on the Berkeley campus. The lower one is actually the famous hockey stick. This is the guy behind that is Michael Mann. Also another guy I know is a very thorough guy. And it uses, before the instrumental record, before the thermometers, a variety of things they call paleo data, which are things like coral rings, I guess, and tree rings, and I think those are the main pieces of data that go into that. And you can see that there's an uncertainty on that gets quite a bit larger as you go back in time. This has had a lot of criticism as well. Some of it actually was probably justifiable in some of the statistical models that were used by Mann in his very first papers. But I tell you, I sat through 3 days of statisticians looking at this data, and they all came up with hockey sticks. They had different curves. If you're a hockey player, you know what I mean. But they all looked like a hockey stick. It basically was flat and then went up at the end.
I actually do get a question, and we're on.
Thanks. So, do you know how many like I've heard that there's like a climate center here. Dave Brillinger from the statistics department is somebody who's...
Yeah, he was interested in the first plot.
Yeah, so I think they're making 17,000 thermometers now.
Yeah.
But recently,
I can go into this if you like. The issue that Professor Muller had was that people like Phil Jones and the whole group in Asheville at the National Center for Climatic Data had used expert judgment to say some weather stations have quality data and others don't. And Muller criticized this, saying, look, you should use all the data. And and then he made a lot of public statements about this must all be wrong because they're hiding something. Well, in fact, he proposed basically a statistical method to use all 17,000 stations, where there was some weighting function that inferred the importance or the quality of the data in all 17,000. And so presumably that those stations that had expert judgment that threw them out would have low weights. And in fact, what he found is he replicated the Jones et al. Plot wiggle for wiggle, which means that his weights were actually done honestly. I had a lot of problem with what he wrote, or what he wrote in the press, because it was not peer reviewed. Where I think this is where the debate needs to be taken, not in the newspapers. It's a stupid place to have a scientific debate.
So when they reweighted the data, they found the exact same plot?
They found essentially the same plot. If his weights had not been very small, he would have actually found that that this plot would have been much steeper, and that the temperature increase would have been a lot larger. And the reason for that is that most of the stations that the expert judgment discarded were in Siberia. We know that it's very clear that high latitudes warm more than low latitudes. So if you included more high latitude points into your average, then it would be higher. And so I don't think Muller understood that either.
And expert judgment is just like they choose to say we want this point or this point.
Yeah, basically, and that even all that is published about what the criterion are. Muller felt that there was shenanigans, which in fact there wasn't, and he retracted that statement. His papers are still in review. I don't think they'll be published because there's nothing new. In fact, it would be the 4th independent replication of this plot, which is, there's no glory in being second. There's very little in being 4th. But let's get back onto track here. So the key questions are, is this warming that this observation has due to human factors? And the key to that is being able to quantify what the internal natural variability is. So what the natural noise is versus what the anthropic is. And so it becomes a classic signal to noise problem. And in fact, the methods that we use to tease this out are basically taken directly from classical electrical engineering. And so more to my interest is if we can identify that that the cause of this is human, do we understand how, what's really going on to the system so that we can make better projections into the future? And of course, the problem that that these figures mask, which is a global average, is that nobody cares about the global average. You care about what happens where I live or where your interests lie. So the talk I heard yesterday was all about local climate change instead of global climate change, and I think that's really the way we need to think about the problem. And basically, in order to do any of this, we need to use computers. Here's yet one more hockey stick that goes back a lot farther, and just has a projection from the last the last IPCC report, and you can see that the carbon dioxide anyway. Oh, that's what this is. This is carbon dioxide. It shouldn't be. That's wrong. It shouldn't be temperature. It's carbon dioxide. But the point is that there has been a huge change to the amount of carbon dioxide. The second most important greenhouse gas, water being the most, since in the Paleo record anyway. Let's skip that one. So here's a projection of the global mean surface temperature as well as what was in the past. And so the black line is basically that observation that you saw. The green line, and there's a little bit of an error bar around it, or a shaded area that indicates some uncertainty, is what the models simulate. These are 20-some global models. Climate modeling is an interesting sociological field in that we share a lot of data. The models are very complex. Groups are stressed to produce the data and realize that they can't get everything out of it by themselves, and they're expensive, a lot of taxpayer money in this. And so data is shared very freely between modeling groups in an organized and coordinated way. And that's what this is. And so you can see that the average of these models does quite well. And then in the future, the colored lines, the purple and the red and the blue are different scenarios of what might happen in the future. And what I mean by that is we don't really know how people respond to global warming, and so how will they, how will energy policies and population growth evolve in the next century? There's a great uncertainty in that, and so basically we get these scenarios from the economists and run them through the climate model, and so. The blue one, basically, there's some stabilization of carbon dioxide at 550 parts per million. So that's a very aggressive mitigation scenario. Whereas the purple one is basically business as usual. And so there is a great deal of uncertainty that stems from how people will react. But there's also uncertainty from within the models. And that's what the shaded light colors are around the lines. But you can see, I mean, the biggest scenario is that, the global mean temperature goes up 8 degrees Fahrenheit, which is from the early part of last century. Or actually, I'm sorry, the middle part of last century. Here it is. This is a picture that I just made. We're probably going to put this in the National Climate Assessment. And it shows a whole bunch of different scenarios. There's these new ones called the RCPs, and they're new models and everything. And one of them is really interesting, RCP 2.6, which is the orange line, the lowest one. That one is designed to limit global warming. This one's in centigrade, I think, is to limit global warming to 2 degrees centigrade, which also is about what is limited over the United States. But this one actually requires negative emissions at the middle of the century. And so that somehow you have to do some kind of removal of carbon dioxide from the air. And there's a large effort actually at the Berkeley lab on developing technologies to do that, so sequestering carbon dioxide. And on this one, there's another one that this my personal favorite because I think it's most likely is the business as usual RCP 8.5, which shows a 6 degree centigrade warming over the United States, which is probably in excess of 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Hopefully this movie will work. All right. So here's, I said that climate change is local. So here's a plot of one model's simulation of the temperature change relative to a nearly present day average, so 10 years ago. And so in the past, the dates running on the top is sort of blue, cooler temperatures. And then as you get, this is the reference period here. This model actually warms more in the southern hemisphere first. Not all of them do that. And then you can see it just basically turns into all warmer colors. And I forget how far this goes. Yeah, it goes into the 22nd century. And you start looking into very high warmings of over 7 or 8 degrees. This is sort of one of the middle scenarios. And one of the things you do notice is that, this is what I referred to before, is that we project that that warming at the poles will be larger than at the tropics. This actually has been observed in the observational data. So that trend will continue into the future. Now obviously this planet would be a very different one than the one we live in. It would have very different average weather, which may matter to farmers. It will have very different extreme weather. One of the things that I have been looking at are hurricanes, and we really have no idea what's going to happen to hurricanes in a planet this warm. There is some agreement that the largest hurricanes will become stronger, so there'll be more Category 4 and 5s, but we have no idea about the rest of them, or in my opinion anyway. Some people have ideas. I'm not sure that I believe them. I'm going to skip that one. This is a projection of changes in precipitation. And this is from the last National Climate Change Assessment. I just plotted the same way for the latest model. So this was 21 models from previous generation. They're about 8, 9 years old. And so now I think there were 19 brand new models with run of a different scenario. Plot looks exactly the same. And so my colleagues are sort of worried about this. And it's like, well, you've spent 10 years and untold billions of dollars on climate change modeling. What have we learned? Well, actually, in some sense, we haven't learned anything other than the fact that what we knew before is very robust. Lots and lots of things. Models are much, much better in simulating the past climate. But the future climate that we simulate pretty much looks the same. And so what does that tell you? It tells me that you can do a lot of violence to this and get the same answer, which means that, to me, that these projections are robust. And so it's kind of an interesting projection for the United States. In the wintertime, it's probably going to be considerably wetter, and in the summer, in the southwest, it looks like it will be drier. And so you can make these kind of plots and say, all right, this is what it is. But I think if I want to have confidence in this, and I've shown some hatching where there's a metric, basically signal to noise, that's greater than 1, to give you some guidance as to where you might have a confidence in those projections. But I think at the end of the day, you really only have confidence in these projections if you know what's happening. And the answer, and actually I do know what's happening, fortunately, at least in this part of the world. Not in every part of the world can I say that, but in North America and probably Europe as well, the wintertime moistening in the north is due to the fact that it's warmer. And warm air holds more water than cold air. There's something called the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship that puts numbers on that. But I went to school in Wisconsin, and the first year I went there it was below 0 Fahrenheit. The high temperature is below 0 Fahrenheit for 3 weeks. And it's very strange because you go outside and it's a beautifully blue sky. And the reason for that is it's too cold for the atmosphere to hold any water. In the summer, of course, it's quite different. It's hot and muggy there. And that's what's happening here, is it gets a little warmer. Well, it gets quite a bit warmer, actually. And so the atmosphere can hold a lot more water. So if it can hold more water, then it can rain or snow, perhaps, in this case. But that doesn't explain the drying in the southern part of the continent. And in fact, that place gets warmer too. But what's happening there is something completely different. It's a different mechanism. What's happening there is something called the Hadley circulation is expanding. Now, the Hadley circulation is governed by the size of the tropics. Well, the tropical region of what are tropical temperatures increases. It changes the flow, the general circulation, the flow, as it were, of the atmosphere. And so places where air was descending have moved, and so it hit drier. And so this picture, actually, I have a lot of confidence in it because I understand two competing mechanisms that are at work. Now, the details of where it goes to zero are quite interesting, actually, and I think that's a harder question to say. But obviously, somewhere between going up and going down, it's going to be zero. That's not rocket science. Skip that one. Here's another projection. This is something called the Palmer Drought Severity Index. So this is a derived quantity from model output. In spite of increases in some parts of North America, this drought index suggests that it's going to be drier. Brown is I forgot the color scheme, the numbers on this, but brown means that it's more likely to be drought. And the reason for that is another thing we understand, is that as the temperature goes up, evaporation rates go up. And so even though there may be an increase in precipitation in some places, evaporation may exceed that, and so the soil dries out. And that's very, something that dry land farmers, which are most of them west of the Mississippi, before they get to California, would worry about quite a bit. So historically, climate models have been limited by computer speeds. When I started in this business in 1990, and at that time, the first of these coordinated model intercomparison experiments was done, or was underway, actually, and that's the group I joined out in Livermore. And it took a whole year to do a 10-year integration of only the atmosphere. Now, the climate consists of a bunch of things. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the global resolution of the grid was really quite coarse. It was only 64 in the longitude, 32 in the latitudinal dimension, and 10 in the vertical. And so this is a very coarse model. In 2011, CCSM5, which is a publicly available climate model from NCAR, which is the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, can do a fully coupled atmosphere, ocean, sea ice, and land, I should say, and get 15 years in a day. And so that means we can do climate change simulations of a century or two in a fairly rapid amount of time. We also can do control simulations to get at the noise, which are a millennia. And the resolution of this model is tremendously increased. I mean, it's 1 degree in the atmosphere, which is 365 by 180, and 26 in the vertical, which arguably should be higher. And then it also has an ocean model, which at 1 degree, which has even it's actually higher than 1 degree in some areas, and has 40 vertical levels.
Question?
Go ahead.
What computer does it in that fast?
Oh, that would be Hopper,
Hopper, okay.
which is a Cray XE6. But they run a lot on the Oak Ridge machine, but I don't want to talk about them. I'm very provincial at the end of the day. So, current resolution isn't high enough. Go ahead.
I have another more scientific question, I guess.
Yeah.
So have they been able to reproduce any of the climates that we've seen already?
You mean,
Like,
like
I
we,
don't know,
we, we can
1990, say. I don't know.
we can do I think we do a good job actually. Let's go back. Oops, it's going the wrong way.
Oh, I must have missed it. Sorry.
So in this picture, the green is a multi-model average, average of 19 models. So the noise is damped out. The interannual
that's not
variability
like
is damped out. And the little black line, thin black line, is observations. Now, that's globally.
So,
And
the
so
green one is
globally,
something-
we do really well.
But like maybe the computational models that you're doing, you
Yes.
know, like you're getting to 1 degree accuracy.
So I think the question then is, why do you want to go to higher resolution if we can do this well with relatively coarse? You know, in fact, these are like 1 and 2 degree models. This one was
No,
3 and 4 degree models.
your
but
computational models, like the ones that show this. Yeah, maybe we go
those
back.
are the computational models.
Can you go to the one with the U.S. and
Yeah.
showing like autumn, spring,
These are the same models.
and so can you show me what the climate in 1990 was?
No, no. And the
Oh.
reason is basically the climate is a chaotic system. And so to pick out a certain year
Okay,
is,
maybe.
in these kind of simulations, is not something we do.
What about the decade?
Even the decade,
What about
30
the
years.
century?
30 years.
30 years.
30 years.
So if you
Um,
picked like 1960 to 1990,
Yeah, yeah.
you
we,
could say what the climate was then.
we do that pretty well.
Oh,
I don't think I have any pictures of that.
so
But actually, this is a controversy that that's in the press again, and the debate is conducted in the Wall Street Journal, which is the wrong place for this. I wrote my paper in Geophysical Review Letters, which I think is the right place to have this. And the question is, if you look at data since the global mean data, in fact, since 1998, it looks like global warming stopped between 1998 and 2007. And the reason for that is 1998 was the biggest El Nino that ever happened. And so there's this huge spike in 1998 in global mean temperature, because that's what happens when there's an El Nino. And so obviously after that it's cooler. That's internal variability. That's a natural variability of the climate system. And so some people went to Congress and said, look, this climate stuff is all hooey, because it's, the global warming has stopped, which is absolutely wrong. And the reason it's wrong is because it's too, the fact that the planet cooled, or maybe only warmed very, very slightly between 1998 and 2007 is true. No question about that. But my first reaction was, so what? And what I realized later is that people don't understand, they don't understand noisy systems. And they don't understand noisy systems in noisy transient systems. In fact, the key point is that climate change and internal variability, the internal noise, at the decadal timescale, they're about the same magnitude. And so you could have a natural variation that cancels out the human part. But as you average longer and longer, the internal variability goes down, but the climate change signal stays about the same. And so, so at 30 years, there's no question. And there are no 30-year, well, since the middle of the century when climate change really started off, there are no 30-year averages where the planet cooled.
So you say you have a more fine-grained results. How these results influence, like, by having this more fine-grained result, what's the?
I'm going to get to that. That. Next couple of pictures. But let me tell you what we want. And so what we want on the short time scale is 10 or 20 kilometers in the atmosphere. What we want in a long-term time scale is actually, actually I'd like it now, but it's not computationally feasible, is to get to, say, 1 kilometer resolution. And the reason for those demands are different. The first one is to really simulate extreme weather better, and the second is actually to simulate the processes better, to go to a kilometer, where we can actually resolve individual cloud systems. The weak point in all of the climate modeling are clouds, and clouds are important because they interact with radiation, both the solar radiation incoming and the infrared radiation leaving. And so we can get that at 1 degree basically directly. Anything coarser than that, we have to have what are called parameterizations, where we have statistical models of clouds. Let's skip that and go right to what you get for your resolution. So here's a paper from a paper that Phil Duffy, who used to be at Livermore, wrote, where he was one of the first to look at the effects of precipitation and effects of resolution on precipitation. And at the time, the state of the art was a 300-kilometer model, which is shown in the upper left. And he went from there to 75 kilometers. Oh, and then the observations are down in the lower right. And you can see that these plots don't really look a whole lot like each other. Perhaps the Pacific Northwest is about what you'd expect at this kind of coarse resolution, but there's missing a high precipitation in the wintertime in the southeastern United States completely. And so he went to 75 kilometers, it helped a little, but then 50 kilometers, it helped quite a bit. And in fact, I've looked at the same with extreme precipitation, and when you get to 50 kilometers, it really starts to look much, much better. And so what's happening here? Well, in the average, for the average precipitation like this, what's happening is the mountains get higher as you go to finer resolution. And so there's something called a gravity wave in the atmospheric flow, which is simple. Basically, if a parcel of air goes up, eventually it's got to come down. And so as air flows over the Rocky Mountains, it goes up, it comes down somewhere. The higher it goes, the faster it comes down. And so air isn't descending rapidly enough at the 300-kilometer model, and so it's probably moving correctly in the correct speed west to east, but it comes down too slowly, so it ends up coming down over the ocean, and so that precipitation is too large over the ocean from this effect. And so at 50 kilometers, our mountains are high enough that we get this phenomena. So that's one of the reasons why to go higher, is to resolve the atmospheric flow at continental scales better. Oh, I'm glad I put this picture in. This is the extreme precipitation case from a paper that I wrote, and the observations are again in the lower right corner. They're at 25 kilometers, but the models are 200, 150. And what you can see in the 200-kilometer model is that it's just simply incapable of making storms intense enough to match observations. But at 50 kilometers, you do have storms intense enough to match the observations. Now, there are details that are important that are not there, but we can start then asking about deficiencies in the model formulation that are not related to just simply the size of the grid. And the good news is that computers like Hopper allow these kinds of simulations, and that's what we've been doing lately. I'm going to show you an animation. You can download it from this link. There's a couple in there, but I forgot to go to the right directory. So. We're looking at here is something called total precipitable water, which you could think of as clouds, although it's not clouds. And this is a 25-kilometer simulation made on Hopper. What you see in this simulation is a lot of interesting behavior. I mean, there are storms. You can see hurricanes generated in there. There's a couple right there. Then they spin out. This model actually does very well in counting in the counts of hurricanes. And it has them in the right places at the right times.
What's the total time period here?
This is just a couple of months. There are some longer simulations on that website if you like. I've stared at these for hours. There's some. Let's go to a different one.
Question?
This would be 1979, and I'm not sure whether that was an El Nino or La Nina year. I'm sorry. This is a longer simulation. What I want to show you is right. It's going to be in this period. Okay. All right, now watch India, and you'll see the monsoon all of a sudden start to form. So we're in May. Monsoon season is June, July, August, September. And then all of a sudden, you've got, I can't see it from there. You see that India is basically covered in moisture. And so the model's simulating a monsoon. It's a little hyperactive, actually. But one of the interesting things is you also notice the moisture doesn't cross the Himalayas. Because in this model, the Himalayas are really high. Similarly, well, 300-kilometer model, they're not. But even more so in the Andes, which is more sharply defined. And you see the same thing happening there. Is that moisture, that wind basically is going east to west, hits the Andes, and then basically turns around. So there's a lot of realism in this simulation. I'm really enamored with it. But here's another simulation which I think is quite interesting. I think it's this one. Yeah, all right. So here I'm showing, the bottom one is the same movie that you just saw. The top one is a similar model at 200 kilometers. So here's what you get for all your money, is you get details. Let's do that again. Actually, let's look at the longer one. No, it's not that one, I'm sorry. That one. So clearly there's a lot more detail in the lower one. But the interesting thing is that if you're sitting in the back and you're like me and you need to wear glasses for that kind of thing, they're going to look the same. Or very similar anyway. I can see you doing that. And this is actually good. What it's telling us is that the large-scale circulation, which all those projections that the IPCC has made and the National Climate Assessment have done, based on these models that are resolutions at the top, get the large-scale circulations more or less correct. But if we want to ask questions about the details, we have to go to these high-resolution models.
So I guess we see hurricanes in the bottom, but not the top.
Right. That's exactly it. And in fact, this study was motivated by an interest in hurricanes. I'm going to show you, that's what the next slide is, in fact. So, you could look at this and try to count the hurricanes, which I tried when I first started doing this, and that kind of made me nuts. Maybe nuttier than I am. And so we went.
This is a relative scale.
Yeah, relative scale, yeah. And so we obtained a tracking code, which basically takes the output from that model and tries to do what you would do by eye automatically. And so here's an early we're trying to redo this. There's some issues here, like we didn't look after outside of 40 north and south. That's why things just sort of artificially end. But these are all the hurricanes, or all the tropical storms to Category 5 tropical cyclones in this model over a period 1982 to 2000 as simulated. And we could peel that off, and here's just the hurricane strength. And here are the Cat 2s, the 5s, the 3 to 5s. 4 to 5, no, Category 4 and 5 are what are called intense hurricanes. And the interesting thing is this model actually makes them at 25 kilometers. It doesn't have to. And there are other guys with models that are at this resolution that don't make anything higher than Category 2. So that's one of the interesting research areas. And in fact, it even makes some Category 5s. And you can see there's one in the Atlantic, a bunch in the Pacific. And so we can compare this to what was actually observed over the period. And so the total number of tropical cyclone and stronger storms observed per year globally is 87, with a standard deviation each year of 8. The model makes 84 plus or minus 9, which is basically right in there. At hurricane strength, the real world has about 50. The model makes 52. Divided up by these categories. The interesting bit here is that the number of Category 4 and 5s per year globally observed is 15. And so the model makes 8.5, which I expected to make less than observed, because 25 kilometers is still pretty coarse when it comes to simulating a hurricane. Here's some computational details. It is expensive. But we did only use just under 8,000 processors on a 120,000 processor machine, this Cray XE6 Hopper machine. And that calculation for 30 simulated years took 5.5 million processor hours. That took about 3.5 months with the queue. But there are models that are coming. That was the NCAR Community Atmospheric Model, CAM 5.1. There are versions of that model coming out soon that easily scale to 50,000, if not 100,000 processors, which means you can get these kind of calculations out of the box a lot faster. 100,000 processors to use on a 120,000 processor machine is a tall order. And in fact, that doesn't happen very often. But the Department of Energy has a 750,000 processor machine on order to be installed at Argonne. And I understand it would be an IBM Blue Gene. And we've actually written a lot about this in our division about where future technologies are going to go. And it's fairly clear that machines in excess of 10 million processors could be available in the next decade. And this leads to lots and lots of interesting computational questions. We're advocating a strategy which we call co-design, which means that one designs hardware and software together, which also means that such machines would be more special purpose than a general purpose Cray or IBM Blue Gene. If you want to know more about this, just go to Google and search Green Flash at Berkeley. But this idea does label me a radical, which is okay because I work in Berkeley. Large data sets are another really interesting computational challenge that these kinds of models at 25 kilometers and finer pose to us. This simulation that I did generated 100 terabytes of output. About 50 of that, or 40 perhaps, was tied up in very high frequency three-spatial dimensional data that we saved for one purpose, and that was to be able to run regional models at perhaps higher resolution. I haven't been able to talk anybody into that yet, but I think that I've got some people that are interested. We just have to get the time. The hurricane tracking problem that I showed you would take about 1.5 years to do on my workstation. And of course, it wouldn't be good for anything else because it'd be swapping memory in and out. So my colleague Prabhat, up at the lab, who's also a PhD student now here, has rewritten the code to it's embarrassingly parallel in the time dimension. The expensive part is anyway. And we basically can run a decade in 2 hours on 3,650 processors. Basically making this kind of science much more tractable. We can start looking at sensitivity in the tracking algorithms, and we have plans on that. And so this kind of analysis has to be done on parallel machines. And this is a real difference that just happened in the last 2 or 3 years, not last year really, where we've been able to produce enough data that we can analyze it on our workstations. And so there's a cultural change that has to occur in our community to start thinking about how to do our analysis on parallel machines. Please.
How do you do parallel in the time dimension? Like, do you swap?
Well, in this case, it was really simple. The data sat in a lot of different files because they're so large, and so we typically in a serial processor we would have some kind of utility to span these things and just go in one time slice at a time. In this case, what we did is we sent basically one day to each processor. And the expensive part of this calculation is a pattern search, where we have a pattern for that we're looking for, which is high vorticity and a low pressure centered in the middle of that. And that searching algorithm scales as a square of the number of cells. And so if you double your resolution, you actually make your number of cells go up by 4, which means the algorithm for searching is 16 times more expensive. And so that's what made this a very intractable problem. The code originally had been used on, say, 50 and 100 kilometer.
So you don't need to like update the previous time step?
You do, but the problem, interestingly enough, that part is so inexpensive that we don't need to parallelize that. The expensive part is going through each time step and identifying candidate storms. And tying them together one to the next is actually fairly simple. What we do there is you basically say, okay, I've got all these candidates at this time, and I have all these candidates 3 hours later, because that's how frequent the data was taken. And we have some criterion about, well, if it's here, then if there's another one that's within a certain radius, then they're the same storm.
I see.
And we've actually generalized this abstraction to other kinds of storms, including storms that hit California. There are two kinds. One called atmospheric rivers, which are the Pineapple Express. You might hear the forecasters talk about it. Then the other standard kind, like we just had, called an extratropical cyclone, which come off the Aleutian Low. And basically, it's the same thing. You look for a pattern, and then you string them together. And the looking for the pattern is always the expensive bit. So that's an interesting development that I think is posing. There's a lot of easy work to do, in fact, that hasn't been done because we haven't needed it. And so the great progress will be had in the next year or two. But what's in a climate model? So how do we produce this data? I sort of alluded to this. Basically, we try to model each of the major systems in the climate that can be sort of isolated, but then they have to communicate to each other. The atmosphere being obviously one of them, the ocean being another. Sea ice is important, the land, and in some cases the chemistry, including biochemistry, if you're interested in modeling carbon dioxide directly, rather than the calculations I showed to you that carbon dioxide was specified, as prescribed, as it were, whereas the latest emissions, which are more closely tied to the economic model output and involve carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere from that. So actually that adds uncertainty to our projections because we've added a whole nother physical system to try to model. But the atmosphere basically can be divided up into two parts. The equations of motion, which we call dynamics, and then everything else, which is always called physics, which is kind of a poor choice of names, but that's what it's called. And that is basically subgrid scale processes that we don't model explicitly. So turbulence being one of them, radiation transport, clouds, moisture cycle in general. The ocean is mostly dynamics. There is obviously a turbulence closure in it, and that's about it, I think. Sea ice is interesting because the equations of motion are not the Navier-Stokes equations, but are rather viscoelastic plastic dynamics, and so that's a very stiff equation. It was, up until about 10 years ago, a very difficult set of equations to solve, but some folks at Los Alamos made a breakthrough in how to discretize the equations, and now the sea ice models are probably one of the best or in my opinion, one of the most robust components of a coupled model. If you drive the sea ice model from Los Alamos from observations, it's bang on. I mean, it gets, it will do next year's sea ice or last year's sea ice, pretty much as it happened when driven by observed atmosphere and ocean input parameters.
Question?
The land is actually very inexpensive, and chemistry can be very expensive.
So it has like floating icebergs? I mean, that level of...
No, because it's not at that resolution. But say the interesting thing is the extent of the annual sea ice. How far, basically that's actually been well publicized, is that as climate has warmed, the sea ice has retreated. Not the permanent sea ice has retreated, but what really retreated is the wintertime temporary sea ice. And in fact, climate models, when they're fully coupled, like all this, tend to underestimate that retreat. And but the reason for that is not in the sea ice model. It's in errors in probably the atmospheric model, in fact, that don't do the polar circulation as well as they should. Elizabeth Hunke at Los Alamos had a presentation a year ago where she showed how well she could do when driven with sea ice, and it really was really vindicated, I think, a lot of criticisms that they've had. But technology does limit us, obviously. I think I referred to this. And the way it does is that not only do atmospheric models and ocean models, which are solving the equations of motion, the computational demand scales with the number of cells. Obviously, if you double the resolution, you quadruple this number of cells. But you also have to have the time step. And so doubling the resolution is actually 8 times more expensive. And so if one wanted to go to this 1 kilometer resolution, that's the green flash stuff we talked about, one would require, just to do the atmosphere, 28 petaflops sustained. And so
that's to run the model in the same time it now takes?
That's to run the model about 5 times slower than what we currently run them at, which would be sort of the minimum what we expect, or what we need. But actually, I chose that metric for a speed based on the level of pain we were willing to tolerate a decade ago. So obviously, they're expensive because there's a lot of stuff to calculate. And this is why successful modeling efforts actually are large, because there's a whole bunch of different expertise that you have to have. You have to have oceanographers, you have to have atmospheric dynamicists, you have to have radiation transport people, you have to have computer scientists. If you don't have computer scientists, these projects fail. And you can look at the world set of climate models and tell which ones have serious computer science efforts in them and which ones don't. And it's not just the size and resolution of their calculation, it's how well they do. The ones that don't take computer science seriously don't do as well as the ones who do.
So can you replicate the data from 1970, say, for the sea ice?
If you drive it with observed atmosphere and even modeled ocean, yes.
So
Elizabeth can do that.
What the size of the ice cap should be?
Absolutely. But if you did that in a fully coupled model, there's a couple of things going on.
Yeah. Yeah, you were
One
saying
is the atmosphere's got a lot of chaos in it, so you wouldn't expect it to be exact.
Yeah.
But the other is there are high latitude circulation errors in these models that.
So if you could get the atmospheric model right,
If you
then
get yes, and
you think that you could get that one right?
I think so. And actually, high resolution in the atmospheric models will help that. So besides being a lot of stuff, the burden also is that these time steps that are limited by this thing called the Courant condition, which is why you have to have the time step when you double the resolution, which is stability criterion, means that these time steps are pretty small. And so that time steps are in the minute scale, and we want to do simulations that are a century, and there are a lot of minutes in a century. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit here and just show you an example of how these models are built. And I don't expect you to really take much about atmospheric modeling out of this, but I want you to think about is more general task of modeling something that you don't know what the answer is. You know what the equations are, but you can't solve them analytically. And so how do you go from that set of equations to numbers? And so the task is just simulate the equations of motions, the dynamics, the Navier-Stokes equations for the atmosphere, solve them numerically. And so what do you know? Well, the Earth is pretty much a sphere. You need to discretize the planet, and you know what the equations of motion are. In this case, the atmosphere is very laminar in its flow, and so we can divide. We can consider the Navier-Stokes equations to be two dimensions in the 2 dimensions being in the horizontal, and couple them less explicitly in the vertical. So the way that you might go about this, and it in fact is a standard method, and is the method that was used in that high-resolution simulation that I showed you, is to just divide the globe up in spherical coordinates, which is a latitude and longitude projection. It has an advantage in that you can make that uniform in the 2 angles that define the spherical coordinates. But it has a very disadvantage in that there's a very non-uniform cell size. You can see by this plot, which is obviously much cruder than when you would, well, maybe it's like those ones at 1990, but that cells near the equator look more or less uniform in their, they're almost square, but by the time you get up to the pole, they have a very high aspect ratio. And that's because of a polar singularity, where they have the convergence of these meridians. But that being said, this is a fairly simple grid to discretize on, and there's a lot of technology that do both finite difference and finite volume approaches. The finite volume approach is what was used in the calculation that I showed. So the 2 issues, the first is this Courant condition. I put it here so you see what the equation is. Basically, the time step has to be less than the grid space and divided by a velocity, which is basically the maximum wind velocity. In the atmospheric case, that turns out to be the jet stream, which can have a speed of up to 180 miles an hour or so. And there have been it's hard, but people have tried to experiment with changing, having different time steps at, say, different altitudes, but it's not a pretty code. So that's the limit there. And then the other problem is, again, related to this high latitude thing, again, relevant for your sea ice issue, is doing a simulation of fluid through a singular point, in this case, a polar singularity. And so if you had a flow that goes across the pole, you could have an imprint of the mesh, and you often do, in fact. And those cross-polar flows actually are very, very important, not just to sea ice, but to wintertime weather. When that happens, it's called a blocking event. So you have that's what happened this year, in fact, over Europe. That's why it was so cold. There was a blocking event over Eastern Europe, and so it was very, very cold. And so well, it was very cold because air came down from the poles, basically. And so it's important to be able to simulate that if you want to get the climate right. Now, you can get some relief on the time step by by kludging it and realizing that the resolution in that high resolution in that one dimension, because the cells are long and skinny up at the poles, is actually false. And that's because if you think about what happens to a parcel of air, it can go anywhere on the planet. If you're integrating for 100 years, it will go anywhere over the planet. And so it will go from a region of high resolution to a coarse resolution. And so, so what people have done is basically violate the Courant condition and then explicitly damp out the computational instabilities with a filter. It works really well, but it doesn't map well onto parallel computers very well. It was developed, when we were running on vector craze, fast Fourier transforms. But it's still commonly used. And it's in some cases it's a black art, though.
So thanks for mentioning. The next lecture will be about parallel FFTs.
There you go. There you go. So that was latitude, longitude. Another way is called spectral transform. And this was the most common solution to this pole problem. And that was basically you take the equations of motion and you transform them onto spherical harmonics directly. This means that you have to have both fast Fourier transforms and Legendre transforms, of which there are no fast Legendre transforms. And the problem with fast Fourier transforms, which we use for this, is that there aren't any parallel fast Fourier transforms for the Fourier wave numbers of interest, which tend to be, well, I think the highest is 1,500 that anybody's run. The parallel FFTs tend to be, at least when I read about this last, tend to be at much higher series lengths, like 30,000 or something. But maybe it's different now. And so you replace these different equations with these transforms. It has an advantage that has no singular points. The time-step stability criterion is uniform, so you don't have to resort to any of this kludgy filtering stuff. It's also very, very accurate for two-dimensional flow. But the fast Fourier transforms have a scaling issue that, well, it's good that it doesn't scale as m, the length of the series, squared, but rather m linear. They tend to be very fast if m's a power of 2. And the vector machines supplied that they used to supply us really fast ones. Now that's not the case. There are some disadvantages. Well, I talked about the FFTs, but they also work very poorly in regions of steep topography, like the Andes or in Greenland. Greenland is really interesting. Basically, it goes from sea level to a mile up in a very short period of time because of the ice sheet. And so you get what is called spectral ringing. And this is a snapshot from a spectral model of precipitation, just instantaneous. And you can see here that there's very high precipitation falling on the windward side of the Andes. But then you have this band of precipitation right here. That it's just a lighter blue. That is false and is this Gibbs phenomenon. It also turns out that some recent work by a student of mine at the University of Michigan that at high resolutions they don't simulate individual hurricane properties as well as say the finite volume does. Now hurricanes are out in the middle of the tropics, so the grid is pretty uniform there. So it turns out that latitude longitude meshes do quite well. But the spectral models tend to not, all things being equal, except for the dynamical discretization, they tend not to simulate storms as strongly as the finite volume, which may explain why some of these models don't get category 5s. In that work, actually, what's interesting about that is he devised a test problem of an idealized hurricane and then just subjected a whole bunch of different dynamical cores to that's what they call these things, dynamical cores, to see how the effect of this this issue of how you discretize the equation of motions would be on those kind of intense storms. Precipitations are varied. CCSM3, which was the last generation of the NCAR model, used a one-dimensional domain decomposition to implement this. It didn't work very well, really, in my opinion, because it restricted the number of useful processors. You couldn't really run on more than 128 processors. And that was just artificial because of the way that the code had been calculated, how it had been parallelized. The European Center, which actually has run with a spectral truncation. So CCSM3 was sort of limited to T85, which was the 128 processor case. So that was 85 wave numbers. European Centers run up to 1,500, and they do theirs differently. They basically do each major part of the code with its own domain decomposition, and they do a global communication of all the data in between each one of these, and it seems to work quite well.
Question. So all the high-resolution simulations you showed earlier in your talk, were those done with a spectral method?
No, they were the finite volume on a latitude, longitude.
Okay.
But all that stuff is antique. And so now what I want to talk about are other formulations. And so, so here's another way to discretize a sphere. You start with an icosahedron, which is the structure on the left. And if you bisect each of the triangles that make up an icosahedron, you form something that looks a little closer to a sphere. And so you bisect it, and then if it were like a child's toy, you'd pump it up a little bit. Or maybe overinflate it. That's the way I like to think of these. And so that we call the n=2 discretization. Do that again, that would be n=4. Actually, that's n=3, I'm sorry. It has an advantage, it has no polar singularities, and it has a fairly uniform mesh. But 6 points in each hemisphere have a different connectivity, which you kind of can, if you stare at this picture on the right, you might be able to detect. But basically, some are connected by 5 vertices and some are 6. And the 6 special points are the original points of the icosahedron. So the ones at each of the poles and then the 5 that go around. And so 10 years ago, 15 years ago maybe, that was a real serious issue. And what's happened is that people spent a lot of time on those special points, and they developed techniques to reduce that input by 6 or 7 orders of magnitude. And so it's still there. If you run an idealized problem where the flow is uniform, say in a east to west, and there's actually an analytical solution for that equation or that problem, you'll see an imprint eventually develop. But the imprint is very slow, and it's so small that in a real-world simulation, the natural chaos of the system overwhelms that imprint. And so these models now are quite tractable. And in fact, the Green Flash project, where this hardware software co-design, we looked at one of these models from Colorado State, and that's what this picture is from. This is a coarse resolution version of it. The model that we were interested in was n=12, so 12 bisections of each of these triangles, which leads to a resolution averaging around the globe of around 2 kilometers. And so this mesh is actually ideal for finite differences and probably for finite volume, although I don't think people have done that. It's also easily decomposed into 2-dimensional subdomains, so one can use many, many more processors. In fact, we think millions at the 2-kilometer range. But the connectivity is very complicated. It's not logically rectangular. But that being said, there's a big group at Japan running on the, well, first the simulator, now there's Simulator 2, and we're planning on the K machine. And they plan to run a global model at 400 meters, which would be n=15, I think. And this is just crazy. I mean, it's just unbelievable. That that it even runs faster than real time, and it apparently will.
Would they need to discretize all the cities to get the resolution of all the buildings? I mean, at some point you get that.
Well, at some point,
right?
well, this is good. That's actually, well, actually, there is high resolution surface data, and
Yeah.
you know how you use that, I don't know. These simulations obviously are experimental, but from a computational point of view, it's just unbelievable. They are much farther ahead than the United States. I just spent a week with them in Hawaii, in Maui. It was nice, where they were telling us about this. And they have, ever since the Earth simulator, they have taken climate change modeling very, very seriously, and continue to do so. It's very exciting.
Is it known that there's no way to tile the surface of the sphere in a perfectly regular way?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. I should have said that. Here's another alternative that will be very important in the next year or so. The model that I ran, the CAM, is going to this grid. It's only a matter of time before they work out the kinks, as it were. It's similar to the icosahedral grid in that it's also can be very uniform. It only has 8 special connectivity points, and those are the original. You start with a cube. Imagine again a child's toy that was a cube, and you overinflated it so it made a sphere. You'd still see the edges of the sphere on that, or edges of the cube on that now spherical toy. And so basically, you know, in this case, you basically divide up each of the spheres in a uniform way, and then pump it up. It has the advantage that the grid is logically rectangular. It's not as spatially uniform as the icosahedral grid. And in fact, it can actually, at very high resolutions, be very non-uniform in terms of, if, say, the area of the smallest cell to the largest. But that can be relaxed, and it is nowadays, by making the grid cells relaxing their local orthogonality, and so when one can do a transformation that gets rid of orthogonality to get a more uniform coverage, that has an implication to the equations. Basically, then one has to have cross-term derivatives. But computationally, that actually isn't, there are not so many of those, and so it's not such a burden as I might have guessed.
How bad is the spherical approximation of the Earth, and do you account for it?
At these scales, it doesn't matter. But the Earth is a little broader than a sphere at the equator because it spins. But it's, you know, it's compared to the radius of the Earth, it's something you can measure because satellites are so accurate. But it's not something we worry about. Good question, though.
Just out of curiosity, what happens if you start with a tetrahedron and subdivide it?
Pardon?
What happens if you start with a tetrahedron and then subdivide it? It seems like you have no special points that way.
I don't know. This is the point, is there isn't a unique way to do this. And I would argue that this method of the cube sphere, which I spelled wrong, and the icosahedral approach are clearly superior to our previous efforts. It's not at all clear that one of these is superior to the other. There's another mesh that I think is kind of kludgy, but people in Japan are looking at, where well, there's a yin-yang one where it looks like baseball. And then there's another one that where you basically can map onto a hemisphere fairly uniformly. But so you have to tie in, so you have some weird thing happening at the equator where you knit 2 separate grids together. It looks nuts to me, but these guys have results that are not nuts. And so so I don't know the answer to your question, but it would seem like an obvious thing to do, and maybe there's a literature on it. I don't know, but the point is that there's more than one way to do this. And then just for fun, I wanted to show one last mesh that's not for the atmosphere, but rather the ocean. And in ocean, the planet's still spherical, but you don't have ocean everywhere because you got land. And so you could use a regular, logically rectangular mesh if the North Pole was like the South Pole and covered with Arctica. But we don't have such a continent. And so, so there was a clever, in fact, orthogonal transformation of the spherical coordinates that put the North Pole over Canada or in Siberia. And it looks like this. And this is fairly interesting, but this is not what they use nowadays. And I don't think I have. Oh, this is what it looks like in the region of Greenland. And so it's actually not as uniform as they wanted. And so they've done another transformation. I don't think I have it. I'm sorry. Where they took the pole and they split it. And so basically gave an east pole and a west pole, which is actually a story about Christopher Robin and Pooh Bear, but who's looking for the North Pole, and he talks about the East Pole and the West Pole. But so the point is it's a different problem in the atmosphere, and so there may be a different solution. In fact, as weird as it might sound, of giving a West and East Pole to a planet. So this is the reason I went through this is not, because I love dynamical cores. In fact, I don't. But I wanted to teach a lesson, and just really a general lesson of modeling systems of any kind. And it's always a set of compromises. It's not exact. If it was exact, you'd just crank the algebra. So you have to remember that it's not exact when you're interpreting results. And when you're designing a model, there are some things you really have to take into account. And so the fundamental equations, of course, are dictated by the physics, which may vary. They're different if you're in the ocean and in the atmosphere, even though they're the same fundamental equations. They have different, say, densities and viscosities and whatnot. And so you really need to take those factors dictated by the equations into account when you're developing your discretization procedure. And so the scale of interest, which may be, in my case, it's this high resolution and long time scales, but in a weather prediction mode, they're not interested in long time scales, and so they may develop a different algorithm to go for a 10-day forecast than for a 100-year simulation. Accuracy is always important, but may not be the most important thing, especially when you're modeling a chaotic system. So in the climate, the memory of the initial conditions is lost in 3 weeks or so, and so it's not necessarily important that the equations of motion be solved exactly to round off. And in fact, there are people that are advocating that one of the ways to get to the exascale may be to do fuzzy arithmetic, and so and just sort of embrace the internal chaos of the system. And I don't know if you're going to talk about that or not, Jim.
How important is it to, even if you get some things inaccurately, to say conserve energy to lots of digits or other things like that?
For climate, conserving mass, which would be water and air, mass mainly, and energy are the two most important things. For weather prediction, you don't actually care about those things because the errors are small enough that after 10 days, you don't care. And then the kind of machine that you have is important. I grew up on vector machines, and so algorithms were very different than what we than what we have today, because we have these highly distributed parallel machines. But if we went into the 10 million or 20 million or 30 million or 100 million processor machines, we have to relook algorithms again. So all those things are important. And there are huge opportunities, I think, for computer scientists in this area. Sustained petaflop computing is going to take millions of processors. I'll finish here. Efficiencies, 5% is considered very good. If you get your sustained rate is 5% of the peak rate, that's considered really, really good. Usually it's more 2%. But I think in order to get into the exascale, we really need to do like 30 or 40 or 50%. And that's the hardware software co-design thing. And then I mentioned the large databases, I think, is just really taking off. I'll just skip to this one since we're over time. So people like me have identified there's a problem. And at least for a while, the general public seemed to accept it. I'm not so sure they do. It's kind of crazy. It seems to go with the economy. But your generation, we leave to do something about it. And computer simulation will play a major role. So thanks very much.
So we had lots of questions. Are there any more?
So especially in the atmospheric dynamics side of this modeling, how much are the climate scientists and the aerospace CFD people learning from each other and teaching from each other and advancing? Is there any commonality in the codes and the algorithms?
Not in the codes. But yeah, in algorithms, I think there is, some things are really unique to each discipline, but some are not. Particularly time stepping issues. Implicit or semi-implicit methods borrow between those two disciplines extensively.
What about weather forecasting?
What about it?
Do the two correspond?
Oh,
in any way?
yeah. They do. They're
try
obviously
and match
much more closely related than general aerodynamics. And there are some groups like the Met Office in Britain where they use the same code for they call it the unified model because they used to have two different models, but they use the same code for both their climate studies and their weather forecasting. But and so it's possible. They configure them differently though. In the United States, there isn't that level of coordination for reasons that are probably more political than anything else. And then Europe has its own, this ECMWF, the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, is a consortium of 14 European nations. And they don't do long-term climate modeling, but they've started to get into the seasonal forecasting, which is related to climate. Seasonal is pretty good. The 3 to 6 month forecast is for El Nino, for instance, which is sort of the dominant mode of variability you're trying to project. They do quite well. Yeah, they did. They predicted the past 3 or 4 La Nina El Nino cycles have been quite accurate.
But they predicted the cold snap this winter in Europe.
That's not an El Nino phenomenon. That was a blocking, and it probably didn't. Not with a 3-month lead. One of the real challenges that I'm not actually a believer in, but there's a lot of effort going on, is trying to predict decadal scales. So what will the next could you have predicted in 1997 that the 1998 to 2007 global temperature was lower than it might have been if the previous 10 years had been replicated, and that means one has to be able to forecast modes of variability other than ENSO that are longer. Some things like they're called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation is the big one, and the Arctic Oscillation, and there does not appear to be, to me, any skill past 5 years that you get by incorporating a detailed initial condition, making it a detailed initial condition problem. And the reason for that are that errors in observing the ocean are large enough that that those errors propagate. So at 10 years, the skill of a 10-year forecast where you tried to make a detailed initial condition estimate of the oceans is no more skillful than if you didn't.
So maybe I'll ask the last question, which is maybe one technique that some fluids communities use that I haven't seen in climate is adaptive meshes. Seems like that's not
well,
playing
actually,
a role.
you know, people have been advocating this for a long time. Phil Colella is now funded to do such a thing at the Berkeley lab. I remain a little skeptical. And part of it is because of the way you saw in the animation that I showed, in that there's interesting phenomena at many, many places.
I'm looking at that going, I don't know what I'm going to do.
Now, I should say, though, that there is an effort at Berkeley that is an ideal application of adaptive mesh, and that's ice sheet modeling. And Dan Martin has taken the Chombo code and done a wonderful job of mapping the equations of ice sheets. This would be like Greenland and Antarctica onto adaptive mesh. And the reason this is so interesting is that in Antarctica, for instance, there's nothing going on in the middle of the continent. And so a 10-kilometer resolution is fine there. But all the action is at the edge of the ice sheet. And there's where what they call the grounding line, which is basically the edge of the ice sheet before it becomes a shelf where the icebergs come off of. And the location of that is really, really critical to the stability of the ice sheet. And in order to predict that location, simulate that location, one has to be very high resolution. I think we have to be at 250 meters. And so Dan has generated some.
About 2 kilometers now.
Yeah.
It's still not enough.
And that won't change very rapidly compared to hurricanes. Yes.
Well, actually, catastrophic.
Well, it moves throughout one season. It's shifting
Yeah,
back and
yeah,
forth
yeah.
and moving around. And we're at 2 kilometers now, and I'm looking at that result, the kind of trends there, and like we're still not there yet. And you know, it's another couple, but it's
but it's tractable.
Oh yeah, we'll get there. You know.
Yeah, no, I'm extremely excited by that. Because that you know the stability of the ice sheets is the 800-pound gorilla in climate modeling. Because if Antarctica melts, you know, New York's underwater, and lots of other places. Thank you.